So I know in the Dr. Phil, one of the things that came out was been that he came back down to play with a toy. Like when he's down and people are sleeping, has he ever talked, like, did he get the sense that someone else was in the home? Did he hear anything? I don't know how long was he up?
No, we've never asked him that. I don't know.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Kudos to the interviewer, Ashley Flowers, because by hook or by crook, she got John to talk at length about Burke. And that is something we want to look at. And she also got responses about something else I've never ever seen him talk about as much as he did on the show, Lockheed. In the first 15 minutes, John might have mentioned Lockheed close to a dozen times. This is astonishing given to what extent Lockheed was very neatly, in my opinion, excised from the headlines in 1996, 1997, 1998, 1999 and beyond. I have always wondered what the situation really was with Lockheed behind the scenes, because John was a PR disaster for them at the time, when they were courting General Electric to sell Access Graphics, which they ended up doing for just under $3 billion. That was less than a year after John Bonet's death. Perhaps some of the most interesting new psychological meat and potatoes is the repeat and refresh we get on John's classic psychology, just the way he has dealt with this case all along, capable of recalling astonishing details when he wants to, but then suffering a total memory wipe or an attack of vagueness when we're dealing with other crucial areas, such as Burke revealing that he went downstairs on Dr. Phil. Can we talk about that? And John saying he either didn't know about that until then, or that he thought Burke misunderstood the question. Now, I think what made the biggest impression on me, especially in terms of this interview, is just how confident and relaxed John is in terms of his game. Except I can't help thinking a more relaxed John Ramsey wouldn't even need to do these interviews in the first place. So perhaps there still is a need that he has to counter the narrative that's out there. And perhaps it's a narrative that won't go away. In any event, we're going to deal with 5 of my observations from this interview. It really is quite insane in some ways. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed, remember on Monday that special is coming out on Netflix, so look out for that. I'll also be dealing with that on this channel, so if you want a reaction video, that'll be waiting for you on Monday. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. I hope you're enjoying your weekend. If you are, you can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So number 1, the specifics of the ransom note. At 33 minutes 15 seconds, John quickly glances at the camera and he explains why he didn't react when 10 a.m. came and went. Although I've written a few books on this case, and although I was aware of this aspect, I nevertheless had to go back to look up the text of the ransom note, specifically with regard to what he says about tomorrow. Let's first listen to him talking about this particular topic.
The note said, "I will call you at 10 o'clock tomorrow." I didn't know if tomorrow was tomorrow or the day we were in. So when 10 o'clock came and went, I thought, oh my God, I got to wait another 24 hours for this call to come.
Now, I don't want you to pay too much attention to the detail that we're going to go into, although we are going to look at the details. But we're going to take the sort of main ambit of what we're talking about here and address that. So don't worry if you're not sure about where these details are taking us. In any event, if you go to the ransom note, this is the reference it makes to tomorrow. When you get home, you will put the money in a brown paper bag. I will call you between 8 and 10 a.m. tomorrow to instruct you on delivery. The delivery will be exhausting, so I advise you to be rested. Now, would a man really say that in a ransom note? If we monitor you getting the money early, we might call you early to arrange an early earlier delivery of the money, and hence an earlier delivery. And I think delivery is scratched out and then it's replaced by pickup of your daughter. And it's quite interesting, the references to delivery, pickup, given that, John's business was a business about distribution of computer parts. In any event, the other thing interesting about the ransom note, this part of it is, it starts saying you must follow our instructions to the letter, but then this part about tomorrow basically says if you go out earlier to get the money, then we might pick it up even earlier. But they've just said you must follow our instructions to the letter, and then after that, any deviation of my instructions will result in the immediate execution of your daughter. So surely you should withdraw the money from your account, not early, I guess, because then we're going to call you early. It's just quite a vague sort of thing. Now, the ransom note, the way John claims to understand it, that it was written before the fact, right? It was written before, while the family were out, supposedly. And I think that's even something that John Douglas subscribes to, crazily enough. Well, it seems to suggest that John Bonet was killed earlier. That's basically the woods that I'm trying to guide you towards. That's really what all of this is sort of pointing towards, right? That John Bonet was killed on December 25th, an impression that is further borne out on John Bonet's gravestone. The date on the gravestone is December 25th, 1996. I believe that both the ransom note and the gravestone are a decoy when it comes to time of death. That the date on the gravestone, just as the date in the ransom note, are a decoy. And remember the use of the word decoy here, because I'm going to come back to it. I also find it interesting that John is able to recall this detail with unfailing clarity, and it's one that he repeats quite often in his interviews. It is, in my view, a misleading contrivance that takes us down the garden path to an earlier time of death rather than a later one. And time of death is crucial in every case, but in this case as well. And it's a similar scheme that we see in the McCann case as well. For how long did we think that something happened at 9:15 or 9:20 when actually the incident was actually taking place close to 10 to 10 or 10 p.m. Now, I believe the actual time of death in the Ramsey case is after midnight, perhaps as late as 1 o'clock in the morning on the day after Christmas. That is when Melody Stanton heard the scream, and that's when shortly after the scream, Melody Stanton's husband, Luther, when do we ever hear about him? He heard the sound of metal crashing on concrete, and Lawrence Schiller describes this in his book. I think it's somewhere around page 531, 532, that Melody Stanton's husband had heard a crashing sound, the sound of metal on concrete, sometime after the scream. Now, I've always imagined the sound of metal on concrete to be the sound of a softball bat tossed out of an upstairs window and landing here. There was a time when I thought that crashing sound was perhaps a bicycle that had slipped on the snow. That was another theory I had once upon a time. Now, let's not forget the world of trouble the pineapple found during the autopsy caused the Ramseys, because it not only suggested a different timeline to the one that the Ramseys put out there, but it also suggested that John Bonet was ambulant when they said she was asleep and in bed. And if a pineapple fragment had time to move to her small intestine, and she ate it sometime after 10 p.m., perhaps even 11 p.m., even later, then it further narrows down the time of death to a window closer to 1 a.m. Do you see that? So I do think that tomorrow in the ransom note is a potential decoy, just like the flashlight was a decoy, just like the duct tape was a decoy, just like the supposedly open broken window was, in my opinion, a decoy. Number 2, vagaries around Burke. Now, what I'm trying to show you is just how specific John can be when he wants to be. For example, a specific word and a specific time and specific observations made by Linda Arendt. And then when it comes to Burke, well, then he can get quite vague. But he can also get quite specific. For example, when he makes this reference.
School year, how do we get him to school without being photographed? And it became a project. And the way it was diversion from grieving. We would send out a decoy car.
Now, do you notice that John uses the word diversion here in context? It's a diversion from grieving, but he nevertheless uses the word diversion. It's a quite unusual reference. Have you ever heard someone saying that they were crying over a lost child and this was a diversion from grieving? I mean, anyway, and then he revisits the idea of a diversion by saying the word decoy, saying we would send out a decoy car. Now, what is the difference between a decoy vehicle, that's an actual vehicle used to protect Burke, and a decoy vehicle that's a ransom note used to protect Burke, among other things? Now, I just find the use of these words, diversion and decoy, when John is talking about Burke, and he chooses to talk about these things and use these words out of the plethora of things, evidence, anecdotes that he could theoretically otherwise choose from. Then at about 7:02, the host brings up specifics regarding Burke, saying how, and I played this at the beginning of the clip, how on Dr. Phil, Burke mentioned going downstairs by himself. But what does John do? Now, this is where he could deal with the specifics of that. And it's such an important area. And then does he? Think about how important is the area of the tomorrow of the ransom note when the whole ransom note appears to be bogus. And I mean, that was ascertained. That was certainly what the police felt by the end of that day. They felt, well, this wasn't a kidnapping. We aren't looking for kidnappers because they don't exist. That was a diversion. That was the police's interpretation of the evidence. And so when the host asks about Burke going downstairs by himself, John brushes all of this off, firstly by struggling to answer, and then by saying, no, we've never asked him that. Maybe after 30 years, perhaps you could. But the question is, how long was Burke up, and did he see or hear anything? Such an important question. It's impressively dismissive because in a scenario where John Bonet did die later, Burke is theoretically the best witness we have. And yet when the host moves the interview in this direction, John is not only not interested and has nothing to offer, but at 7:22 he folds his arms. He does the same at 5:58 when the host says, I'm not necessarily talking about him doing something, and then John seems to consciously make the effort after folding his arms to unfold them. But it's important to note what the context is that causes John, what the exact words are that seem to trigger John into folding his arms. And once again, this is when the host takes him into the tricky area about Burke. Now, I haven't watched the whole 90 minutes, but is there anywhere else that John folds his arms like this?
What are the things that the parents don't know? Like, what's happening?
No. You know your children.
Well, and I'm not necessarily talking about, like, him doing something, but
Yeah.
I'm saying, like, they hang out together. They have the same group of friends. Like, was there someone that maybe she didn't tell mom and dad about, but she's going to tell her brother about, or her brother? Like, did you guys have any of those, like, moments with Burke to be like help us figure this out?
And what do you think John's answer is to that? Did you ever ask Burke for his opinion on everything because we want to try and figure this out? And you kind of got like this almost 30-year-old cold case, and we really want to solve this case, but we actually don't want to ask Burke about it. The bottom line, though, is showing this contrast between the super detail of a word and its significance from the ransom note, and then something even I had to go and look up, right, the thing from the ransom note, to the absolute vagary and guardedness around Burke. Now, if you study the Ramsey's police statements, those given in April 1997 and June 1998, and many of the other statements they've made, this seems to be a strategy they employ. If they talk about things they want to talk about, they can access incredible detail. They can go on for a long time just regaling you on all the little details. But as soon as it's in a tricky area, then the details dry up. And then there are one-word answers or I don't know. That brings us to number 3. Patsy was a good mom. Now, John describes Patsy as a very strong woman, and I think Patsy was. But the narrative around Patsy that she was too medicated to give an interview and that she was hysterical at the crime scene, and she was so emotional that the friends around her were trying to sort of comfort her. Even the 911 call, you get a sense of a hysterical Patsy. All of that suggests not such a strong woman. Now, I mean, it could be Patsy pretending to be more emotional than she really is. I kind of got that feeling with Karen Reid as well, and also from the Black Swan case, certainly while she was in trial. Now, you know that moment when a beauty queen wins the title and they act all shocked, as though they had no idea they might win, when that's why they're there. Maybe it's a little like that. Now, I do say this with sympathy. I'm not trying to take a pot shot at Patsy, but Patsy couldn't have been a good mom when she had stage 4 cancer. I mean, who could be? And the whole bedwetting, shit smearing narrative, we hear some of that via one of the housekeepers. I think that is a kind of artifact of that period, and I wouldn't say it's unnatural or unexpected. It's just part of the trade-off when someone is going through a difficult time. It stresses them. A mother that is stressed leads to a family that is stressed, right? Patsy is stressed, and the kids and effectively the whole family were under a similar kind of stress and strain, because what's happening? Patsy's fighting for her life. And so I think without any doubt it was traumatic. So I think if you say, what was Patsy a good mother? I think that's missing the actual argument here of what is the true dynamic going on. So I don't think one can equate that with Patsy not being a good mother, but it does take us into the delicate area of a family that are under strain. Understandably, a businessman working hard to build his business, a little girl entering back-to-back beauty pageants at the age of 5 and 6 years old. There's quite a lot of pressure on her, as well as a host of other family pressures and dynamics, and how do they actually function and interact with one another. Number 4, I didn't profit out of what happened to John Bonet.
You're joking. I lost my job. I was not employable.
Now, it's funny on this question when he says, when the question comes up, did you profit out of what happened to John Bonet? He laughs, he smiles, and he says, you're joking. I would, I think, be quite pissed off about it. I think I would look quite angry about it. Now, the interesting thing is John says something about he wasn't employed for 6 or 7 years, which then suggests he was. I would love to know in what capacity he was employed. That if I was questioning him, I would have asked him that. Because to be honest, I don't know what job John ever had after he was at Access Graphics. Maybe there was a job, I just don't know what it was. I know he ran for political office. I know that was something. Now, it might seem a cheap shot from me to suggest that John did or may have profited out of what happened to John Bonet, but I didn't ask the question, the host did. The reason I want to peek into this is because I just dealt with it in my previous analysis. In 2016, the Ramseys launched a $750 million and I think $150 million lawsuit against various parties. So if you win that, then you make a couple of $1 million. If the Ramseys didn't get anything out of that, their lawyers certainly did, and we know that the Ramseys at a certain point sued almost everyone. Linwood also said what he said. Do you remember that? He said, I made more money handling the Ramsey case than you've made in your whole damn career practicing law. I also think the question, the way it's framed, is the wrong question. The right question is, how much did John stand to lose? Remember, he was already wealthy in December 1996 because of the killing of John Bonet. The timing of John Bonet's death and the timing of John's business success is something almost everyone misses. And I often say the answer is time. The $1 billion in turnover milestone in late 1996, when I say late, I mean even past mid-December 1996, was what made the sale of Access so lucrative, so appetizing to General Electric in the following months, up until November, December 1997, which is why they paid just short of $3 billion for it. Now, how big a piece did John get out of that pie? Because I think there was a reason they kept John on. So, when John says he lost his job, well, he actually kept his job for another year. And they only cut him loose right after the sale of Access to GE. And if John had just think about this, if John had no defense going into early 1997 and no lawyers, and he didn't go into CNN, and there was no intruder narrative, right? And no ransom note, and no theory besides that a family member did it, what do you think Lockheed would have said then? So I also think if you ask the question about lawyers, why they lawyered up, and you don't bring Lockheed into that equation, well, then I think you might be missing something. And that brings us to the fifth and final point, the decoy psychology. Now, again, what's the difference between a decoy vehicle that's an actual vehicle used to protect Burke and a decoy vehicle that's a ransom note used to protect, let's say, Burke as well, among other things? I just find the use of these words, diversion and decoy, when John is talking about Burke, quite interesting. Think about all the things in this case that were potentially decoys. And I mentioned a couple of them a moment ago. The flashlight on the kitchen counter, the pillow on the kitchen counter, the 3-page ransom note, which is filled with decoys. Besides movie quotes, foreign factions, SBTC, the $118,000 reference that makes you think that there's an insider with a gripe, kidnappers that don't exist, and ransom demands that no one ends up demanding. A kidnapping victim that isn't kidnapped to begin with. She was in the house all along. Isn't that a decoy as well? The duct tape on John Bonet's mouth. The idea that the toggle rope was actually a murder weapon and created to be a murder weapon, created to be a garrote. Also, arguably, the narrative diversion of turning a certain kind of sexual interference into essay by an adult pedophile. Now, remember on the morning of December 26th, Burke was also secreted from the crime scene, and he was virtually absent when Aunt went to question John and Patsy at the end of that long day, December 26th, after getting a search warrant. I think it's fair to say that Burke has been the least questioned member of the Ramsey family, by far, not only in terms of then, in 1996, but now as well, almost 30 years later. You can talk about protecting a child, but that child is now almost in his 40s. Doesn't he want John Bonet's killer to be found? Because he doesn't act that way if he does. I also find it interesting how comfortable John is in being the spokesperson for the Ramsey narrative, as if he wants to be and has been in control of it all along. Versus, I just think if you contrast that with Burke, who seems to be extremely uncomfortable talking about everything, and he doesn't seem to be in control over it, and he hasn't been all along. I also find it telling when John says that Burke doesn't want to talk about it, presumably even to him. What's that all about? Why not? In any event, that is 5. That's enough. I'm not going to take it further than that. I think that's enough from the first third of this interview. If you'd like me to continue my analysis, let me know in the comments. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.